This happened a few years ago when I was living on a farm. My stepmom was really into the idea of living off the land. We tried a few times before, but finally found a nice house with a piece of land that already had an asparagus farm. We moved in and soon got some animals, chickens, ducks, and a few rabbits. We let the chickens and ducks roam freely around the property, and everything was great at first. They seemed happy exploring the farm, and we had no problems. But after we raised a new batch of ducklings, something strange happened. 2 of our 4 adult ducks just disappeared. There were no feathers, no signs of a struggle, just gone, like they vanished into thin air. We thought maybe they wandered off since we had a creek at the back of our property that connected to a bigger river, but we weren't sure. One evening, it started to rain, so my stepmom and I rushed outside to make sure all the animals were safe in their shelters. While we were checking on them, we heard a duck quacking in the woods. We ran across the property to see if it was our missing ducks. My dad and brother grabbed their guns and went toward the creek to help search while we looked along the tree line. As I was checking behind the old barn, the woods felt a bit creepy in the fading light. I was heading back to where we had split up when my stepmom came out of the woods, looking worried. The creek at the back split off into a small stream, which made it easy for animals to wander off without us noticing. While we were facing the stream, we heard whistling coming from the woods in front of us. We thought it was my brother, so we started looking for him, trying not to scare any ducks. About 30 seconds later, my dad and brother came running out of the woods from the opposite direction, asking why we were whistling. We were confused and said it wasn't us. My dad and brother said they hadn't done it either. We all agreed that none of us had whistled, and that we had people who could confirm where we were. The whistling had come from right in front of us, but there was no sign of anyone there. No movement or other sounds, just the whistling that happened several times. About a week after that, a similar thing happened. I wasn't there, but my brother and sister were. It was around 8 p.m., and even though it was summer, it was getting dark because a storm was rolling in. They looked toward the back of our yard, about an acre away, and saw a man crouched down in white clothes. My brother fired a shot into the air and told him to leave several times before the man ran away. My sister said she saw the man standing behind a fence post before my brother noticed him. She only told him about it when the man moved, and she could clearly see it was a person. My sister mentioned the man had a strange glow around him, which made him noticeable in the dark woods. I'm not sure if these incidents are connected, but after that, my parents were very clear that we weren't allowed to go into the woods anymore. When I was a kid, my brother and I lived on a huge farm west of the Mississippi. Our farm was massive, with thousands of acres mostly dedicated to growing corn. The cornfields stretched out so far that they seemed endless. On days when we weren't busy with chores, we loved exploring those fields, but we mostly stuck close to the house. One day we decided to explore deeper than usual. We were trying to reach a creek that ran along the far edge of our farm. We'd been there a few times before and enjoyed the cool, refreshing water, especially on hot summer days. As we walked, chatting and laughing, we suddenly stepped into a clearing in the middle of the cornfield. The clearing was about 40 or 50 feet wide and surrounded by tall corn. It felt strange because clearings like that weren't supposed to be in the middle of a cornfield. We had never seen anything like it before. When we reached the edge of the clearing, we saw about 10 men standing there. They immediately stopped what they were doing and stared at us with wide eyes, looking shocked and worried. They seemed like they were caught doing something they shouldn't be. I noticed a few things in those few seconds. The men were all white and appeared to be in their 40s or 50s, dressed in neat, non-farm clothes, like button-up shirts and slacks. They had set up several large pieces of electronic equipment in the clearing, looking like they could be folded up for quick transport. It made the clearing look more like a makeshift workspace than part of our farm. One of the men reached out his hand and started to step towards us, his face showing a mix of surprise and concern. Seeing that, my brother and I didn't stick around. We turned and ran as fast as we could back through the cornfield and all the way to the house. We didn't say a word to each other during the run. We were too scared and unsure of what we had just seen. When we got home, we wanted to tell our parents, but our mom was in town, and our dad was helping a neighbor. When Dad came home a couple of hours later, we told him what happened. He listened to us excitedly and a bit hysterically and decided to check it out with us. Since it was already dark, he said we'd go first thing in the morning. The next day, we went back to the spot where we had seen the clearing, but when we got there, the clearing was still there, but completely empty. All the corn had been cleared away, and there was no sign of the men or their equipment. Dad agreed it was weird, but didn't seem to believe anything more than that it was just an odd sight. My brother and I still talk about it sometimes, and we both agree it was the weirdest and most unsettling thing we've ever experienced. A few years ago, I lived with my aunt, uncle, and older siblings on a large property far from other houses. Our home was surrounded by a big pasture, and there was an old, abandoned cabin that we never used. My uncle liked to tell me stories about the land, and one night he told me a scary one about the cabin. According to him, the cabin used to belong to a farmer and his young daughter. They lived alone on the farm. The father worked hard while his daughter, who was around 6 years old, played nearby. One day, while the farmer was using his tractor, a terrible accident happened. He saw his daughter too late and tried to shout for her to move, but she didn't hear him. It was a tragic story that was hard for me to believe or accept, maybe because it scared me so much. My brother Robert, who is usually strong and fearless, decided to invite some friends over for a camping trip in the old cabin. They wanted to clean it up and use it for their trip. They worked on fixing up the cabin and were excited about their stay. They had no idea about the story my uncle had told me. As night fell, they went out to the cabin. They hung out and had a good time, but things took a scary turn when they were getting ready for bed. Robert, who went to bed later than his friends, was lying in one of the old beds when he woke up to what he thought was someone crying and a faint scream from outside. The sound seemed to come from the pasture, and they scared him. He felt like something was trying to get into the cabin and couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Robert tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be coyotes, but the crying and screaming continued. When he finally sat up, he saw a little girl at the foot of his bed. Her face was hard to see, but her body was covered in cuts. She was crying in a way that made Robert feel sick, as if she was in a lot of pain and there was nothing he could do to help. Robert and his friends ran back to the house, sweating and shaken. They woke everyone up, but it was hard to understand Robert at first because he was crying, which was unusual for him. His friends didn't say much, but they were visibly disturbed. The next day, I told Robert about the story my uncle had shared. The old cabin has since burned down, so maybe the farmer's daughter can finally rest in peace. About 5 years ago, when I was around 23, I decided to travel the world. I had just finished college, was buried in debt, and struggling to find a job, even ones I was overqualified for. I felt depressed and lonely in my small town in Washington, so I figured traveling might help. A high school friend suggested I try woofing, worldwide opportunities on organic farms, which is a way to travel cheaply by working on farms. You work about 25 hours a week and get food and a place to stay in return. It sounded perfect. I started in Washington, then moved to Oregon, and finally ended up in California. There, I saved some extra cash by doing side jobs. With that money, I had to choose my next destination. The thrill of being able to buy a ticket to almost anywhere was overwhelming. Following the advice of a free-spirited volunteering partner, I used a randomizer website to pick my next place. It chose Georgia. I didn't know much about it, but that made it even more exciting. I bought a ticket and began looking for a farm in Georgia. There weren't many options, and most were in remote areas with no internet. I sent messages to a few places, knowing only some would respond. One farm did get back to me. It was on top of a mountain, and the pictures showed a beautiful Georgian stone house with a big garden, happy kids, and animals. The description was in good English and sounded welcoming, so I was excited. When I arrived in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, I followed the directions to the farm. It was a challenge. Few people spoke English, and the roads were in poor condition, many still from the Soviet era. After 20 hours of riding old buses and taxis on rough paths, I reached the farm. The dirt road led up a steep hill into a national park. The area was quiet and isolated. From a distance, the house looked abandoned, overgrown and gloomy. When I walked past the gate, a man named Giri, not his real name, greeted me. He was a short, heavy-set guy with a big smile. He showed me around in broken English. I noticed there was no one else around. I asked about his family, but he said they were away. The farm was in poor shape. Apple trees and crops were dying. The barn's roof had caved in, and the house smelled of mold. Giri seemed to be struggling, but I was too exhausted to turn back, especially after 36 hours without sleep. Giri gave me a meal and showed me to my room on the second floor. I fell asleep almost immediately. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise, something heavy and metallic dragging across the wooden floor. I tried to figure out what it was, but eventually shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, Giri, now sober but grumpy, asked me to fix some windows and doors while he went to a nearby village for parts. I started to feel uneasy. He avoided eye contact and was vague about his plans. With no cell reception or internet, I felt isolated and unsure. Once Giri was gone, I explored the house. It looked barely lived in and felt like one of those abandoned places. There was broken furniture, old newspapers, scattered photos, and a shattered mirror. The house didn't match the pictures from the listing, and Giri wasn't in any of them. Panicking, I packed my things and decided to leave. I saw 3 men walking up the hill, so I went behind the house and scrambled down into the forest. I hid behind a bush, trying not to make any noise, while I could hear the men searching the house. After a while, they left. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then headed back to the road. I eventually reached a paved road and started walking. Hours later, a car stopped, and it turned out to be a kind family who gave me a ride to town. The farm listing disappeared from the website a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from Giri since. Some people laugh and say Giri and his friends were probably just coming over for a chat, but I trust my gut. Something was definitely off about them. I need to tell you a story, one that still haunts me and has turned my life upside down. My name doesn't matter, but you need to listen closely. This all happened a few years ago when I lived with my wife on her family's farm in North Iowa. I had no idea that behind the peaceful farm life was a dark family secret that would shatter everything I knew. I met my wife about 5 years ago, and we hit it off right away. We dated for a few years, and since I didn't have much of a family of my own, her parents and relatives took me in like I was one of them. It was a great feeling, being part of something bigger. 3 years later, we got married, and her family allowed us to live on a small property near the main farmhouse. Life seemed perfect, quiet, simple, and full of love, at least that's what I thought. The farm was large, with acres of land stretching out in every direction. They ran a successful meat distribution business, and everything seemed normal except for one thing. There was a part of the farm that was off limits. I wasn't allowed to go near it, and whenever I asked my wife about it, she would shrug it off, saying it was where her father and uncles ran the meat business. It was restricted for safety reasons, she said, and only her dad and 3 uncles were ever allowed in that area. Still, it didn't sit right with me. Why all the secrecy? I started noticing things that made me even more curious. Throughout the week, I would see a lot of vehicles going up to that restricted part of the farm. Some would come back, but others didn't. It was about a mile away from the main farmyard, and I couldn't stop wondering what was really going on up there. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. 3 weeks ago, I decided to find out for myself. I knew I couldn't just ask my father-in-law about it directly, so I came up with an excuse. I drove up toward the restricted area, planning to talk about a problem with some farming equipment. As I got close to the gate, a rough-looking man with a thick beard stepped out from a shed next to the entrance. He was holding a shotgun, and I had never seen him before, but he knew me. Without hesitation, he told me I wasn't supposed to be there and that I should head back to the main farm. I tried to explain that I needed to talk to my father-in-law about a broken cultivator, but the man cut me off and said, "I'll let him know. Now leave." I turned the car around, but before I left, I caught a glimpse past the gate. There were at least 20 to 30 people working, running around and doing various jobs. It looked like a bustling operation, not at all what I had imagined. And then I noticed something else. A dirt track leading away from the farm that I had never seen before. Where did it go? No one had ever mentioned it. That night, my wife told me her father was furious that I had gone up to that part of the farm. She warned me to never go back there uninvited again. I asked her what the big deal was. I worked around heavy machinery every day. I wasn't afraid of danger. She just looked at me and said, "Drop it." The way she said it, I knew she knew more than she was letting on. But I couldn't drop it. Something felt terribly wrong, and I couldn't get it out of my head. I started wondering if her family was involved in some kind of organized crime. But that didn't make sense. Surely I would have noticed something. Unfortunately, the truth was far worse than I could have ever imagined. 3 days ago, I made the decision to find out what was really going on. I woke up at 2:30 in the morning, careful not to wake my wife, and snuck out of the house. I had parked my car away from the farm the night before so no one would hear me leave. I took a detour around the farm, about 7 miles, and found the dirt track I had seen earlier. I parked nearby and began walking down the track, flashlight in hand. It was pitch dark and the air was cold and still. Halfway down the track, I suddenly saw headlights approaching. I quickly dove into the bushes on the side of the road, turning off my flashlight. As the vehicle passed by, I realized it wasn't just any truck. It was a government vehicle, and it had an armored escort with it. My heart pounded in my chest. What had I gotten myself into? Once the vehicles passed, I continued down the road until I reached a small shed with a barrier and a man sitting inside. I didn't want another confrontation, so I found a gap in the fence about 50 meters away and slipped through. The area beyond the fence was lit up by floodlights, and I could hear voices coming from the nearby buildings. There were 2 large barns and 3 smaller cabins. At the far end, I saw a small cabin with no lights on, so I decided to check it out. As I made my way over, I noticed 3 armed men sitting around a fire by one of the cabins. They looked drunk, which worked in my favor as I crept past them toward the unlit cabin. I found an open window and managed to pry it open wide enough to slip inside. The room I entered looked like an office, with shelves full of files and books, and a computer on a desk in the center. I scanned the files with my flashlight, and that's when I found something that made my stomach turn. The files were organized by dates and names. I grabbed one and started flipping through it. The first few pages listed names, but then I noticed something horrifying. After each name, it said unknown, followed by parts extracted. I kept reading. The file listed organs, liver, heart, kidneys, eyes. Page after page, name after name. Some files even mentioned meat for distribution. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare. I slumped to the floor, trying to make sense of it. Was this farm part of a human trafficking ring? A black market for organs? I felt sick to my stomach. I knew I needed more proof, so I decided to check the barns. I couldn't just take the files and leave. I carefully climbed back out of the window, making sure to leave everything as I had found it. Keeping low and staying in the shadows, I moved toward the first barn. When I reached the side, I looked through a gap between the wooden panels. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. I shined my flashlight through the gap, and what I saw next chilled me to the bone. There were blood-stained machines inside. Metal tables with surgical instruments lined the walls. At the far end of the barn was a large door marked Chiller. I didn't dare open it. Instead, I made my way to the second barn, and the smell hit me before I even got close. It was the stench of death, thick and nauseating. I peered through the panels and saw 5 large metal pens, each holding about 10 to 15 people. They were huddled together, some unconscious, others barely moving. It was clear they were being held against their will. I felt dizzy and sick, like I was going to pass out. But I had to keep it together. I had to get out of there and find help. Just as I tried to get a better look, I slipped. My knee slammed into the wooden panel with a loud thud, and the men by the fire jumped to their feet. They started moving toward me, and I knew I didn't have much time. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the fence. I heard gunshots behind me, but I didn't stop. I reached the gap in the fence, scrambled through, and disappeared into the bushes. By some miracle, they didn't pursue me, but as I looked back, I saw something that made my heart drop. There were security cameras on all four corners of the barns. They had definitely seen me. I knew I couldn't go back home. They would know that I knew. I drove straight to a storage shed on the outskirts of town, grabbed a few jerry cans of gas, and filled up my tank. I left that night without saying a word to anyone. Now I'm over 1,000 miles away, trying to make sense of it all. These places exist, and one was operating right under my nose. I've ditched my phone and everything that could connect me to my past life. But I know it might not be enough, especially if the government is involved. I'm using an old friend's computer to share this with you, and I can only hope the software I'm using will protect him from being dragged into this. I don't know what my next move is, but I promise you, I will find a way to expose this nightmare. People need to know the truth. If I can get to another computer or phone, I'll update you. Until then, stay vigilant. You don't want to end up on the list.